Josef Stalin was a lot of things: rebel and ruthless revolutionary, bully and bank robber, prisoner, paranoid beyond belief, and one of the two most powerful men in the world after World War II. He was one of the greatest mass murderers in history, and apparently catnip to the ladies. Stalin had a series of lovers and wives. His second wife, Nadezhda, shot and killed herself after an argument with the Soviet leader, in which she criticized the direction her country was taking under her husband. In the early 2000s, several Russian journalists, both in Russia and abroad, wrote that it was possible that Nadezhda, or Nadya, was actually the dictator's daughter. If you're responsible for the death of millions, incest might not bother you much. Behind the Kremlin walls, amidst the purges and propaganda, the Soviet leader found pleasure in peculiar and often morbid distractions that reveal the complexity and the darkness of his character. The depraved and dangerous private life of Josef Stalin. We know many things about Josef Stalin, but most of those concern his public life. We know about his beginnings in a strict and religious Georgian family, and his 5-year stint as a seminary student, which started brilliantly but ended in rebellion after his exposure to revolutionary literature and the works of Karl Marx. Some historians question Stalin's commitment to Marxism, or Marxism-Leninism, as it was called within the victorious Bolshevik wing of the Communist Party of the future Soviet Union. But he was committed enough to the cause that he robbed banks, organized strikes, recruited new members, intimidated political enemies, and gathered a crowd of supporters around him who attended his lectures on Marxist theory. After a time, he was noticed by the police, and between 1901 to 1917, Stalin was arrested, jailed, and exiled internally to remote parts of the Russian Empire, quite a few times. Every time he escaped and actually crossed the borders of Russia a number of times to meet with Lenin and the Bolshevik leadership as they planned their revolution and how they would change Russian society. One of Stalin's early tasks was to recruit members of Russia's many minorities to the communist cause, and in the early years of the Soviet Union, he was made People's Commissar for Nationalities, as Lenin believed that Stalin's Georgian ethnicity would appeal to minorities in the Russian Empire, which officially became the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in 1922, after the defeat of the conservative and royalist White Army after the bloody Russian Civil War. It's a well-known story. Stalin maneuvered himself into a variety of positions and established relationships with people throughout the Communist Party, many of whom owed their position and the perks and power that went with them to Stalin himself. By the time Lenin died in 1924 after a series of strokes, Stalin had made himself powerful and well-connected. He also had made a lot of enemies and stepped on a lot of toes, including Lenin's. When Lenin died, his will called for the removal of Stalin from all of his positions, as the Bolshevik leader saw the Georgian as a man who was too rude and would alienate people inside and outside of the government, who had excessive self-assurance, meaning arrogance, and who had taken the reins of many of the most important positions in the government, threatening the foundations of Bolshevik democracy, and possibly leading to one-man rule. What did Stalin do? Forged a new will, in which he was lauded by the Bolshevik leader, and threatened the few people who knew the truth with death. Eventually, everyone who had first-hand knowledge of Stalin's duplicity was either killed in the dungeons of the infamous Lubyanka prison in Moscow or disappeared into the ever-growing Gulag camp system. By the early 30s, Stalin had almost complete control of the Soviet Union, but he still saw enemies everywhere. In 1937-38, he began purges of the Communist Party and military leadership, which resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands, and was, without question, one of the most powerful men on the planet until his death in 1953. And along the way, Stalin's direct orders, or the system he created, killed 20 million people, possibly more. The death of love. What could a man like that be like in private? We know that Stalin was extremely intelligent and well-read. He also loved American movies and vodka. He loved getting together with his inner circle and partying all night. Oftentimes, he would single out one man for a special round of bullying, making them dance till they nearly passed out, dress in women's clothes for everyone to laugh at, and much more. The special butt of his jokes from the 1940s on was future Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who was bullied incessantly at these parties and, like the others, had to pretend to like it. In 1956, Khrushchev would have his revenge when he made his famous secret speech to the Communist Party, criticizing Stalin and the cult of personality around him. If that was how Stalin treated his political allies, imagine how he treated his wives, lovers, and children. Stalin's first wife was a fellow Georgian, a young woman named Ekaterina Svanidze, who was known to most people as Kato. In 1906, Stalin married Kato Svanidze, the sister of Stalin's fellow communist and friend Alyosha Svanidze. By all accounts, Stalin and Kato were in love, and she stuck with him even as he evaded the Tsar's infamous secret police, the Okhrana. Unfortunately for Stalin and Kato, the times and place were not so understanding about their union, because it had resulted in a son, Yakov, born less than 9 months after the wedding. In addition to being socially ostracized, the life Kato was leading took a toll on her health. In Georgia, Stalin worked to organize the communists there, made plans, and gathered weapons, so he and his comrades could carry out a daring plan to rob a bank in Tiflis, the largest city in Georgia. While her husband was doing this in one part of the house, Kato, a skilled dressmaker, made clothing for the wives of some of the most powerful men in Georgia, almost all rabid anti-communists. In June 1907, Stalin and his crew successfully robbed the state bank of the Russian Empire. The take? About 1 million of today's US dollars. This forced Stalin to flee Georgia, and he and his wife headed to Baku in Azerbaijan, an oil-producing and industrial city that seemed to be growing faster than the authorities could keep up with, meaning there was very little modern infrastructure, and during their stay, Svanidze, run down with stress, was told to come back to the family home in Georgia to recover. Despite the danger, Stalin returned his wife to Georgia, but on the way, it is believed she drank some contaminated water. Stalin returned to Baku soon after leaving his wife with her family. It was the last time he would see her alive. Kato had contracted typhus and died a painful death. Stalin returned for her burial, a risky proposition. However, it was clear that he was deeply in love with his wife, for when they lowered her into the ground, Stalin leaped into her grave and had to be dragged out by the other mourners. There are a lot of tales about Stalin, and when he took power, he had as many of his files from the Tsar's secret police as well as internal reports of the Communist Party destroyed. Because of that and other reasons, some of what we think we know about Stalin's personal life may or may not be true. One of the lasting tales about him is that shortly after the funeral he said, "This creature softened my heart to stone." She died, and with her died my last warm feelings for humanity. Seems like something a mass killer might say. After all, in the following years, Stalin had Kato's brother, Alyosha, and his wife, along with Mariko, Kato's sister, killed. Suicide and incest? In 1919, Stalin married Nadezhda Alyuyeva, called Nadya, the daughter of Sergei and Olga, who were socialists and knew Stalin from Georgia. By 1919, Stalin had become a powerful man in the new Soviet Union and lived in the capital, St. Petersburg, where the Alyuyevas had relocated. Nadezhda was almost 23 years younger than Stalin, and even at this time, when older men often married younger women, 23 years raised some eyebrows. However, Nadezhda was pretty and very intelligent. She was also a true believer in Marxism-Leninism. She would sometimes engage in political arguments with her husband when she felt bold, for by this point, Stalin was fast becoming the man remembered by history. A friend of Nadezhda's said this about their 12-year marriage and how her friend spent most of her time with her husband. Nadya, in the presence of Joseph, resembled a fakir who performs in the circus barefoot on broken glass with a smile for the audience and with terrible tension in her eyes. She never knew what would happen next. What an explosion. He was a complete boor. One of the most rumored quarrels surrounded a statement supposedly overheard by others. You should know that Stalin was reported to have a series of lovers or sexual conquests during his time on the run before he met his wife and after her death, including while he was married to Nadya. He was also notorious for picking the women closest to him. He knew the Svanidze family well. He was good friends with Nadya's father and mother. The rumors say perhaps he was too friendly with Nadya's mother, and these rumors were reinforced by something people heard Stalin yell at his second wife shortly before she died in 1932. "Don't you know you are my daughter?" Now, knowing what we know about Stalin, this could be the darkest of dark secrets. Given the context, location, and the fact that people were around, it's unlikely that it was some perverse bedroom game. However, Stalin may have begun to think of himself in the same way his propaganda machine thought of him, as the father of the Soviet Union. Nothing has ever been proven, but what we do know is that not too many days after, Nadya was found sprawled in her room, having shot herself in the heart with a .32 caliber pistol. There has never been an accusation made about Stalin having a role in her actual death. It was a suicide. The children. Stalin and Kato's child, Yakov, had rarely seen his father after his mother died. Born in 1907, Yakov had a hard life. After the death of his mother, He lived with their relatives while his father rose to power in St. Petersburg and Moscow. In 1921, towards the end of the Russian Civil War, when Stalin began to lead a more settled life in the capital, 14-year-old Yakov was brought to live with his father. Whether it was that the boy reminded Stalin of his one true love, or whether, as sometimes happens, Stalin did not like his quiet, very reserved son, we know that the relationship between father and son was strained, to say the least. Yakov lived in Stalin's private apartments in the Kremlin, along with Nadezhda Aliyeva, who was only 6 years older than her stepson, and her two children, Vasily and Svetlana. Despite living in Russia's most famous and prominent building, he was forced to sleep in the apartment's dining room. Stalin frequently berated his son in front of others and called him names like dummy. Yakov was not quick, but he wasn't stupid. He eventually worked as an engineer at an electrical plant named after his father, and in 1937, at the height of his father's purge of the Red Army, enrolled in the Artillery Academy and graduated as a lieutenant just a month before Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. Yakov was captured during the massive Battle of Smolensk on July 16, 1941. 3 days later, the Nazis announced his capture to the world. Stalin went crazy, not from losing a son to Nazi captivity, but because Yakov had surrendered, despite Stalin's orders to fight to the last man. He was also angered by the fact that, as Stalin's son, he hadn't committed suicide and had put Stalin in a bad position. Stalin's public reaction was muted. When the Germans offered a trade, Yakov for a German general in Soviet captivity, Stalin refused. He could not be seen using his position to do what so many other Soviet citizens could not do, bargain for their son's life. The Germans received no reply. Some historians believe that Stalin did order others to form a plan to rescue his son, who eventually ended up in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp in Germany, but nothing came of those plans. Others believe that Stalin was quite content to have Yakov become a victim. He would be rid of the son he never loved, but at the same time would be seen by the Soviet public as a man enduring the same trials as they were. Yakov died a horrible death in captivity. He died after being pushed into an electric fence by a British POW after an argument, and then was shot by German guards as he twitched on the ground. Vasily, Stalin's son by Nadezhda, rarely saw his father after his mother's suicide. By the time he was 18, Vasily was a full-blown alcoholic who had to be guarded at all times by his father's agents. He fought in the war as a pilot, reportedly shot down 2 enemy planes, and was hated because the other soldiers believed he was spying for his father. After the death of his father, he was arrested and spent 7 years in jail, being released in 1960. He died of chronic alcoholism in 1962. Stalin's daughter Svetlana was his favorite, but given Stalin's attitude towards his sons, that's not saying much. When she was a girl, Stalin let her order him around, demanding candy, making his aides do dances, and more. Occasionally, she would order the cook to make her favorite dishes and desserts. And when the poor cook looked at the most powerful man in the USSR standing behind her, all he needed was a slight nod to know it was okay. Stalin took orders from no one. Svetlana was the best known of Stalin's children for one reason. In 1967, on her first overseas trip to return the ashes of her Indian lover to his family, Svetlana approached the American embassy in New Delhi and defected to the United States. Her career as a journalist and researcher on her father's life was tightly controlled and monitored by the Soviet government. What she read alarmed her. Stifled by who she was, the control and surveillance she was under, and the truth of what the Soviet Union really was, Svetlana Aliyeva, daughter of Stalin, lived in the USA from 1967 to 1984, when she returned to the USSR with permission of the government. One of her husbands was the nephew of Stalin's first wife, and the son of Alyosha and his wife Maria, both killed on Stalin's orders. While in the Soviet Union, Svetlana showed signs of mental instability and was used by the Soviet media to criticize the West, especially the USA. In 1986, during the first days of Gorbachev's reforms, she returned to the United States, where she died in 2011. She had 3 children. One of Stalin's grandchildren, Cress Evans, is a punk rocker who owns an antique store in Portland, Oregon. This is History on Fleek, and we'll see you next time.